Hello everyone, you are just joining in a literary heaven, the literary nook by Ferry and his Ferry. Let's start our today's topic, but before going further, don't forget to subscribe my channel, like the videos and share. The Romantic period is the most fruitful period in the history of English literature. The revolt against the classical school, which had been started by writers like Chatterton, Collins, Gray, Burn, Cowper, etc., reached its climax during this period. And some of the greatest and the most popular English poets like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, and Keats belong to this period. This period started from 1978 with the publication of the lyrical ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge, and the most famous preface which Wordsworth wrote as a manifesto of the few forms of poetry which he and Coleridge introduced in opposition to the poetry of the classical school. So, in the preface to the first edition, Wordsworth didn't touch upon any other characteristic of Romantic poetry except the simplicity and naturalness of its diction. The majority of the following poems he writes are to be considered as experiments. They were written chiefly with a new ascertaining how far the language of the conversation in the middle and the lower classes of the society is adopted to the purposes of the poetic pleasure. In the longer preface to the secondary edition of the Lyrical Ballads, where Wordsworth explained his theories of the poetic imagination, he again returns to the problem of the proper language of poetry. The language, too, of these men, because from their intercourse, being less under the influence of the social vanity, they convey their feelings and the notions in simple, unelaborated expressions. The Wordsworth chose the language of the common people as the vehicle of his poetry because it is the most sincere expression of the deepest and the rarest passion and feelings. And this was the first point of attack of the artificial and formal style of classical school of poetry. And the other point at which Wordsworth attacked the old school was its insistence on the town and the artificial way of life which prevailed there. He wanted the poet to breathe fresh air of the hills and the beautiful natural scenes and landscapes, became interested in rural life and simple folk living in the lap of nature. A longing to be rid of the precision and the order of the everyday life drove him to the mountains, where he describes in his lines in Tinton Abbey. By attacking the supremacy of the heroic couplet as only form of writing poetry and submitting it by simple and natural diction, by diverting the attention of the poet from the artificial town life to the life in the woods, mountains, and villages inhabited by the simple folk, and by asserting the inevitable role of imagination and emotion in poetry as against dry intellectualism, which was the chief characteristics of the classical school. Wordsworth not only emancipated the poet from the tyranny of the literary rules and conventions which were circumscribed his freedom of expression, but he also opened up before him the vast regions of expressions and experiences which in the 18th century had been closed to him. His revolt against the classical school was in keeping with the political and the social revolutions of the time, as the French Revolution and the American War of the time, as the French Revolution independence, which broke away with the tyranny of the social and political domination, and which proclaimed the liberty of the individual or notion to be the master of its own destiny. Just as the revolution, liberty of a notion or a liberty of a nation from foreign domination was the watchword of the American War of Independence. In the same manner, liberty of the poet from the tyranny of the literary rules and convention was the watchword of the new literary movement, which we call by the name of Romantic movement. It also termed as a romantic revival because all these characteristics, the liberty of the writer to choose the theme and the form of his literary production, and the importance given to the imagination and human emotions, and a broad and Catholic outlook on life in all its manifestations in town, villages, mountains, rivers, etc., belong to the literature of the Elizabethan age, which can be called as the first romantic age in English literature. But there was a difference between the Elizabethan age and the romantic one, because in the later, the romantic spirit was considered as discovery of something which was once but had been lost. And the poets of the Romantic period therefore always looked back to the Elizabethan masters like Shakespeare, Spenser, and the other, and got inspiration for them. They were under the haunting influence of feelings which had already been experienced and a certain type of free moral life which had already been lived. So they wanted to recapture the memory and rescue it from the fading away so completely, definitely. So, in the poems which were contributed in lyrical ballads, Wordsworth dealt with events of everyday life by the preferences in its humblest form, tried to prove that the commonplace treated in right manner could be as interesting and absorbing and as grand and imposing as part of the life and nature. To share of the college felt such subjects were supernatural, which was to inform with that semblance of truth and willing suspension of disbelief for the movement which constitutes the poetic faith. So, Wordsworth naturalism include love for nature as well as for man, living beings, simplicity, natural surroundings, and College supernaturalism, on the other hand, established the connections between the visible world and the other world which is unseen, like as in ancient mariner. So, associated with Wordsworth and Coleridge in exploration of the less known aspects of humanity was Saudi, who makes up with them the trial of so called lake poets and devoted himself to the exhibition of the all more prominent and the poetical forms of mythology which have at any time obtained among mankind. So, Walter Scott, though he was not intimately associated with the lake poets, contributed his love for the past, which also became one of the prominent characteristics of the Romantic revival. Okay, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Southey, Scott belongs to the Romantic first generation. They were in their youth filled with great enthusiasm by the outburst of the French Revolution, which held high hope for mankind. They become conservatives and give up their general ideas with the French Republic converted itself into a military empire. The second generation of the Romantic writers, Byron, Shelley, Keats, Leigh, Hunt, Hazlitt, and others, who came to the forefront after the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815, approximately, revolted from the reactionary spirit which was prevailing at the time in England against the ideal of the French Revolution. So the result was that the second generation came in conflict with the social environment with which their predecessors were in moral harmony. So the victorious struggle with the French Empire had left England impoverished, and the political and social traditions and agitations which had subsided on account of the foreign danger again used or raised, as we can say, the head, and the result was that there was a lot of turmoil and sadness, as we can say, among the rank and the file which was being suppressed by those who were in power. So basically, poets of the two generations of Romanticism shared the same literary beliefs and ideas, and poetic diction was also the main thing among them. Prose writers of the Romantic revival also broke with their inner immediate predecessors, discarded the shorter and the lighter style of the 18th century. They reverted to the ponderous, flowery, and poetical prose of the Renaissance. And Sir Thomas Browne, as we find in the Box of the Lamb and De Quincey, much of the prose of the Romantic period was devoted to the critical study of the literature, its theory, and practice. So, Romantic age was characterized by excess of emotions, produces a new type of novel which seems rather hysterical now, but which was immensely popular among the multitudes of the readers whose nerves were somewhat excited and who revelled in extravagant stories of separate supernatural terrors. So, the essence of Romanticism was that literature must reflect all that is spontaneous and unaffected in nature and man, and be free to follow its own fancy in its own way. And the result was that during the Romantic period, the young enthusiast turned as naturally to poetry as a happy man to singing, and the glory of this age is the poetry of Wordsworth. So, summing up chief characteristic of the Romanticism as opposed to Classicism, we can say that the Classicism laid stress upon the impersonal aspects of the life of mind. The new literature, on the other hand, openly shifts to the center of art, bringing it back towards what is most proper and particular in each individual, and it is the product of the fusion of two faculties of the artist, his sensibility and imagination. Romantic poetry was antithesis of classical poetry, had many complexities, and like classical poetry, agreed upon the nature, form of poetry, role that the poet is called upon to play, and the Romantic poets held different views on all these subjects. The artistic and philosophical principles of new classical poetry were completely summarized by Pope, and they could be applied to the whole of the Augustan poetry, but it is difficult to find a common denominator which links such poets as Wordsworth, Coleridge, Scott, Shelley, Byron, and Keats. The reason of this was that there was abundance and variety of genius. Now, age in English literature was the age of revolutionary change, not only in the view of the characters and the functions of poetry, but in whole conception of the nature of man and of the world in which he found himself in the evenness and uniformity of the classical age. So it was replaced by strong currents of the change flowing in various directions. So one poet reacted to a particular current more strongly and sympathetically than the other poet. So each poet of the Romantic period stands for himself and has his own well defined individuality, and the only common characteristics that we find in them is the intense faith in imagination and, as we can say, the simplicity. That was all for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. Stay connected for more.